And
Okay,
okay, I think we're good to go.
got it. And we can make this available to you also after the meeting.
Yep.
So again, welcome to the training for the project funding evaluation team. And as I mentioned, there's 4 main funding streams that we look at each year. However, the past 2 years, we've had some extra ones because of COVID. So it's made it a very busy couple of years. So the 4 funding streams are the one we refer to as COC, Continuum of Care for Homelessness, which comes from HUD. And that's the biggest and I would say most complex one to score. So we do ask that everyone on the committee take part in that scoring. And then, and that of course is administered, or the staff support is the Planning Commission. So Allie and Kelly. And then every 3 years, we have the Emergency Solutions Grant, which is also out of the Planning Commission, but Joyanne Galliano is the lead for that one. And we won't be doing that one again until 2023, I think.
Correct.
Yeah, so that one's been done. And then Emergency Food and Shelter Program is administered out of the United Way. So that's Sean and Daisha on that one. And then Home for Good, the Planning Commission, Kelly and Allie helped to oversee that one. So 4 main funding streams that are available pretty much every year, except for Emergency Solutions, which is every 3 years.
Once upon a time, we were able to do the Continuum of Care ones once every 3 years, but it's been almost a decade since they've let us do that. So we have to do that one every year. Just a couple of things to add to that, to what Nancy said. You will not have Emergency Solutions Grant this year, but just so you're aware, you may have a review of unspent Emergency Solutions Grant CV dollars, CV coronavirus. We got extra money through CARES Act and through ARPA for housing under that funding stream. And it's all been allocated, but we are kind of reviewing the funding and how it's being spent down. So if we have dollars that need to be reallocated to a different project, PFET would be brought in to look at that reallocation and see how everyone feels about moving those dollars around. The other thing I will say is that we offer PFET to other funding streams and to other opportunities because we have a really great process. An example of this is last year we did the evaluation for the RFP for a risk mitigation fund in York County that was funded as a pilot by the COVID Response Fund, which was the partnership between United Way and the Community Foundation. And we offered the PFET team to help review those proposals and to select an entity because you guys are sort of an unbiased non-housing kind of group. So you're able to weigh in on these things and provide guidance and feedback on how successful, a budget is or how robust a program narrative might be, those types of things. I say that because there might be opportunities for this group to review other items like that. The coalition did offer support to York City around the $1 million that they have set aside from their ARPA funding for homelessness. We reached out and said, if you are looking for unbiased third-party opportunities to review applications for that funding, this group is here to assist. Realistically, I don't think they're going to take us up on it, but that they were offered the opportunity. And there also may be a few other things if the COC does a new RFP for consulting services that help us, we might come to PFET to look at those things. So there might be a few other odds and ends. It's not common. It's usually not more than one a year, and we don't even typically hit that. But just so you're aware, there are a few other things we ask for support on.
And then just to be aware for what happens at our meetings and before the meetings. So before the meetings, you'll get all of the applications, the scoring sheet. We often do a mini tutorial, and then you'll come to the meeting with your scores and ready to discuss and ask questions, any questions you had on applications. And we generally then will come to consensus on making recommendations or scoring at the meeting. However, we may have questions that prohibit us from doing a final scoring or recommendation. So then Kelly will take those questions to the organizations and get the responses for us. And then we'll have a phone call, quick phone call to talk about what the answers were and to kind of reconfirm how we wanted to score or recommend. And then on occasion, and actually maybe every couple of years, we actually have in person, bring the agencies, ask someone to come in and present their proposal to the team. So I think that's a good practice, and it sometimes is an easier way to understand the organization than reading about it on paper. All right, I think we're ready to move to the next slide. I think that's Kelly.
I think this one's me. Okay, so we're gonna talk about continuum of care first. It is the most money that we review and provide recommendation for on projects. It's also the most complicated scoring sheet, and it's also the most complicated process. In addition to reviewing projects and scoring them, which it has very, very concrete items that we score on. But in addition to that, we also have the game of strategy that we have to play with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is what are the priorities for funding this year? What projects do we have in our community that meet that priority most successfully? And what order of projects will make us most successful in not only maintaining our funding for existing projects, but increasing and bringing new projects in. So it is probably the most frantic process. It's a little bit short timing, and it is kind of in depth. So at this point, we like to at least talk about the types of housing projects we see under that funding stream and kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. Now, the one thing I will say, Nancy mentioned we like everyone to rank and review these projects. IRIS is going to be in a little bit different situation because IRIS works for a funding or a project that's funded through continuum of care. So what I'd recommend for you, IRIS, is I'd recommend you go through this process with us, but you will not be able to score because one of your projects is here, and Bell also has other projects in this funding stream. So we'll have you go through it, but we will not have your score count with the rest of the scores when we're looking at everything, so that you can learn the process and understand what we're looking at and why we do what we do. But because you're in one of those projects, we won't have you do that part. So under continuum of care, this funding is about $1.8 million right now. Obviously, the goal is to increase that number every year, but it provides funding for predominantly housing projects or projects that are required for the Planning Commission to meet the criteria for this funding. So the different types of housing we can serve are very narrow. This kind of gives you a description of what those different projects are. We can fund permanent supportive housing. It's listed first. PSH is typically the acronym. This is a permanent housing opportunity. It can be in a building that an agency owns. It can be scattered site with private landlords. It doesn't really matter, but it is intended for chronically homeless households. They can be singles, they can be families. The programs sometimes specify whether they're serving singles or families or both, but those are kind of the options that we can serve. The hardest part about permanent supportive housing is confirming that someone is chronically homeless. Someone who is chronic has to have a history of homelessness for at least a year, or they have to have repeated instances of homelessness over the last 3 years that accumulate to more than 12 months. You can tell just by me rattling that off how hard that is to document and how hard it is to prove, unless someone has continually bounced from street to shelter. More often than not, a lot of the populations in York County will double up. They will live with someone for a long enough period of time that they lose and restart the clock on their homelessness. It is as frustrating for us as it sounds. We know that staying with someone for a month or 2 months doesn't really mean that your homeless situation has changed. But unfortunately, that's the federal criteria. And if we're not going to put someone chronically homeless in that program, we have to prove that there aren't any chronically homeless in our community, which we know is not true. So this is a really hard program to fill people in. People are very interested in permanent supportive housing, very interested. And the reason for that is it has no end date. So a lot of our other programs will provide you with case management and financial support, but it's time limited. Might be 3 months, might be 6 months, might be 9 months, might be a year. Usually isn't more than a year. But permanent supportive housing provides you with a subsidized rent opportunity and case management for as long as you elect to live and stay in that program. So we have a lot of people that are interested, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot that meet the criteria. Right now, Turning Point Interfaith Missions operates a PSH program for York County. Their office is located in Adams County, but they do operate here. That program is scattered site, which means that they place people with permanent or with private landlords and then just maintain relationships with the client and the landlord. The client does hold the lease, so they do not hold the lease. And they also provide case management as well. They do serve singles and families. So they're our only permanent supportive housing program that will serve families. So they are typically in very high demand. Bell Socialization runs the York Apartments PSH. In this case, Bell owns a building and they use that building for 8 units for singles for permanent supportive housing. That program is focused on mental health. So you have to have diagnosed mental health to be a part of that program, in addition to being chronically homeless. As a side note, Turning Point will accept any type of disability, but you do have to have a disability. The Housing Authority works with the York Adams Health Choices Management Program, who's also in the Human Services building where Pam is located, on the Shelter Plus Care program. It is also a single adult or at the most a couple. It's 1-bedroom units, essentially. They also operate in the private market with rentals from private landlords, and then they subsidize the rent. And Health Choices provides support from the case management and services perspective. Any questions about permanent supportive housing?
Kelly, I probably won't be able to vote on that one either.
Correct. You won't be able to. You'll be able to learn the process. So it'll be good for you to learn it.
Yeah.
The next one is Joint Transitional Housing, Rapid Rehousing, THRRH. Transitional housing is typically housing where an organization holds the lease or owns the building, and people can live in that space for up to 24 months while they receive intensive case management and budgeting and employment and childcare resources so that they can stabilize their situation. And then they move on to a unit of their own, which is where the rapid rehousing comes in, where the organization can help them with their move-in costs like security deposits. They can also provide graduated rental assistance so that the person can gradually get used to paying the rent on their own in their unit, and then they close out of that program. We do have bridge or transitional housing programs in York County that are not associated with this housing type, but they are a little bit different and they're funded differently. The thing I tell everyone with the THRRH program, HUD does not allow us to fund emergency shelter anymore, and they haven't for many years. This was kind of their response to that. The intention of this program was that an organization would have furnished, ready to go transitional housing units, and that they'd be used as what they call crisis housing. So you identify someone who has nowhere to go, there's no room in shelter, or shelter doesn't meet their needs. You know, like if someone has oxygen, our shelters aren't equipped to take them when they have an oxygen tank. This would provide an opportunity for you to very quickly move someone who is homeless into one of these transitional crisis units. And then you have a safe place for them to stay while you stabilize them. And you also have funds to move them then into their own space. It's a really great model. We only have one in York County right now. Valley Youth House does that one right now. And it has been challenging for them because a lot of people that come directly into crisis housing have a lot of things going on, and it can be a much more service intensive kind of situation than a lot of others. But it has been really beneficial for them to have a space they can move people into pretty quickly. This housing type is often recommended for situations like domestic violence. So you can very quickly get someone out of a domestic violence situation. You have a place to put them that they can stay until they can stabilize. It's also very common in youth, but there are no limitations around who we can serve with this funding or this housing type. So you could do one of these for families. You could do it for singles. You could do it for anyone. Any questions about that one? Okay, probably the largest thing that we fund with Continuum of Care is the next one, which is rapid rehousing, RRH. You can do this for individuals, you can do it for families, you can do it for youth specific, 18 to 24. We have programs that are domestic violence specific. We have a whole host of different things available under this funding or under this housing opportunity. Most commonly, this is rental assistance with a case management component. Depending on the program, as I said before, some of them are a maximum of 3 months, some are 6 to 9, some are 12 months, but we're really looking to have you off of financial rental assistance and closing at least your housing specific case management by the end of that year. This is where the bulk of our Continuum of Care dollars sit. We have quite a few programs with Bell Socialization through their Next Door program. Technically, the county is the applicant for those. So the Planning Commission works as the applicant for those, and then we sub-grantee to Bell, but Bell does all the work on those after we do the applications. So those are our biggest ones. We also have Valley Youth House has a couple of these types of programs as well. It's a great model, but it is not the best model for everyone. And so I think as a community, we're getting to the point where we have a lot of rapid rehousing, but we're finding a bigger need for THRRH and for permanent supportive housing opportunities where the situations we're encountering are more than just a year's worth of rental assistance. So I think we're starting to see that shift. And we will likely talk as a continuum, as a coalition, about shifting some of the priorities this year to see if we can engage folks that are interested in more of the THRRH or even PSH projects. We can also typically use these funds to expand an existing project. This does change year by year when the grant notification comes out, but the last few years we've been able to do this, so I left it in for training this year. So what that means is if we're already funding a project and that project is interested in expanding the number of units and staff, they can apply for that. Something to keep in mind is that an expansion of a project has to include more housing. So you can't just ask for more staff on a project that's funded. You have to show that you are also increasing your capacity to house folks. We have not had any requests for expansion of projects since this was added, I want to say 4 years ago, they started putting this back in. I think we all find that a little bit surprising, but that's kind of where we sit right now. No one has expanded a project. Even projects that we may have cut in the past have not tried to bring those capacities up to what they used to be. I don't anticipate seeing a lot of this year either. Biggest reason being is I feel like everyone is still really struggling staff-wise, and I don't think anyone feels like they are in a position where if they expand their units, they're going to be able to hire staff to accommodate that increase. So I don't anticipate you'll see much of that this year. There are other things that this funding stream funds, but they do come directly through the Planning Commission. We typically do not score these projects, but the Planning Commission does provide the applications to you, and you are absolutely welcome to review them, to look at the budgets, to determine if you feel like something needs to change. Those two projects are really the HMIS, Homeless Management Information System, which pays for the web-based software that we use for all of our funder reporting, all of our sharing of information between housing providers. It's case management software is really what it is. But you need staff and system administrators and trainers, and you have to pay for the licenses. So that funding pays for all of those things. We also provide computers to organizations that are doing HMIS. So we try to, we don't charge them to use the software. So we're paying for it entirely out of this pot of money. And we're also trying to provide computer equipment where an agency might need equipment and doesn't know how they're going to exactly pay for that through their other funding streams. We also pay for funding for coordinated entry. For those that might not know, coordinated entry, we also call it Pathways to Home, is a housing triage process. The goal being that everyone who seeks housing opportunities through coalition partners receives the same assessment of need, and that we prioritize the folks coming in for assessments and for housing assistance based on greatest need first. Because we know there is not enough funding for housing to help everyone that comes in. We're trying to stabilize those households that have the greatest needs as our top priority. So we receive funding for that as well. That pays for staff time. It pays for us to do things like managing our marketing. We're required to market that process so people know how to access it. So we do receive funding for that as well. The other thing we receive funding through Continuum of Care for that does not get reviewed, you guys never see it, it goes straight to HUD, is a planning grant. So we get about between $55,000 and $60,000 a year to help us have a consulting firm that helps us do our grant application, or to pay for staff time, or to help us pay for training opportunities, so that the planning of our coalition goes on and we have dollars that we can associate with that. Any questions about Continuum of Care? You will have questions, but I mean for right now.
I wanted to clarify. So the chronically homeless definition that's so restrictive is really just for the permanent supportive housing?
Correct.
Right.
You do not have to be chronic for anything but permanent supportive
Okay.
housing. The methodology or the ideology behind that is people who have failed at lower impact assistance, like rapid rehousing or the transitional rapid rehousing combination, are continually returning to homelessness or continuing to experience homelessness that need a longer term intensive support would be under permanent supportive housing. What I will tell you anecdotally, though, is that just about anyone who is on Social Security level income wants permanent supportive housing because they can't afford to live in this market on Social Security income. So right. I always get requests from those that are on that very tight, very fixed income for permanent supportive housing because it is an ongoing subsidized housing opportunity.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we give you a little sample of what the scoring sheet looks like for Continuum of Care. I will tell you this is really a sample. The Continuum of Care scoring sheet is 8 pages. I hope nobody quits after this. It's like 8 pages. But we try to do it as narrowly as we can. So a lot of it is data driven. You'll see on this example, we're talking about how many people reported substance use, how many people had a DV history. Those are all data statistical information. And what we did last year, Allie and I, to help this team was any of those types of questions where it was a percentage or it was a number, it was data driven, we went through and filled those in for you based on the data that we collect on those programs. So you didn't have to do all of the math. We did that for you, but then you could look at those answers and say, wow, like why does that program have no one with a substance use? That seems odd. So you can look at the numbers and have those conversations during the review, but you didn't have to take the time to kind of go through all the data and fill them in. There are other questions that are more qualitative than quantitative. how good was their narrative? Do you feel like they've really captured what they're trying to do with this program in their narrative paragraphs? Those are the things that typically PFET comes in and has a deeper discussion about. Or did their budget feel like it was reasonable? Do they have too much money in a certain category that you feel is unrealistic? But so we try to fill in what we can for you to make the process a little bit easier if it is data driven. But we will not fill in anything that's not data driven, because that's where this group really shines, because you have that opportunity to have those discussions and to argue in favor of or against funding for a project. Okay, emergency solutions grant. I got to move my bars around so I can see my screen. Am I doing this or you, Nancy? I can't remember.
Well, I was going to try doing it and see how well I did. You can correct me. So I'll try it. Emergency Solutions Grant. This is the one that's every 3 years. And I feel like this one has a more broader scope. So it can be for emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, but also homeless prevention, which is unlike the one that Kelly, the COC that Kelly just described. And so it also includes, as you can see from the list of our people that we have funded. So it's emergency shelter, but it's also the coordinated street outreach that Friends and Neighbors does, and some rental assistance, which is part of the homeless prevention piece. Did I get that?
You nailed it. You did
Okay.
great.
All right. Next.
Well, before we go on, I'm going to add a few things for context.
Okay.
So this is one of our rare and unusual that fund emergency shelter, but it's important to note that emergency shelter and street outreach are under a cap. We're only allowed to spend a certain percentage of our emergency solutions grant funding in each of the 3 years that we approve for those activities. So unfortunately, we can't say, we have lots of rental assistance and rapid rehousing under COC. We're going to put way more of ESG into shelter. We don't have that opportunity. And the other unfortunate piece of this is we've been able to create street outreach, which is really important for our community, and we never had it before, but it is lumped together with emergency shelter under that cap. So we're trying to figure out how to continue to fund street outreach without punishing the existing shelter partners who are also relying on that funding. So it can be a little challenging from that perspective. That's kind of probably the most frustrating piece. The other thing I would frame this around is you'll see here that the total allocation in 2020 was about $190,000 through ESG. We received ESG CV, coronavirus, upwards of millions of dollars, and we're able to really broadly expand a lot of our programs. But now we are faced with spending down that money, and we are not anticipating a larger amount of traditional ESG. So we are also balancing that act between we've been able to create more programming, do more housing, but now we are having to close programming down, get rid of kind of capacity because that funding stream will end. There's been no discussion about increasing the amount of this. So I don't know if that will actually be the case or not. But when you look at Emergency Solutions Grant, it is a great funding source, but it is so small. It's less than $200,000 most years.
And I would add that there's a 25% match required. So when you see the scoring sheet, the more match or the more in-kind donations you have, the higher you score.
There's match required on continuum of care as well, 25%. And the biggest thing we saw with Emergency Solutions Grant coronavirus was there was no match. And that provided partners with so much more flexibility to put in and ask for funding. Match is hard. It's hard to figure out what qualifies as match. It's hard to document it. And we all feel, quite frankly, at the administrative level that the match requirements on a lot of this funding is what keeps new organizations from being interested. Any questions about ESG? Okay. I left my ESG CV slide in here just so you would be aware of what it was in case you do have to talk about reallocating dollars. there's not a lot here that's different. We got $1.6 million in ESG CV compared to our less than 200,000 we normally get per year. So one thing that did change so recently that I didn't change it in my slides is that ESG CV has been extended. So organizations have until September 30th of 2023 now to spend all of that money. So they just increased that. Something else to keep in mind, it just came out, is that there are some communities in the country who said, we can't do this. We can't spend this money. We can't allocate this money. Please take it back. And in those situations, HUD is going to be reallocating Emergency Solutions Grant CV dollars. We're hopeful that we'll be eligible for those because we have a pretty good spend down rate at this point. We've spent almost 50% of what we were provided. And they also are looking at communities that focused a lot of this money towards rapid rehousing, which we did. So I'm hoping that there might be additional funding coming in. If there is additional funding, this group would be pulled in and we would have to look at the applications and how we wanted to distribute that. But it does the same kind of projects as Emergency Solutions Grant. It does street outreach, it does emergency shelter, it does rapid rehousing, which is the rental assistance case management components together. And it also does do some homeless prevention. Homeless prevention under regular ESG is really hard to spend because everyone has to be 30% annual median income or less. That is very low income. Under the ESG CV grant, we were allowed to serve up to 50% of the area median income, which allowed us to help more people. But under regular ESG, you'll find that those numbers under homeless prevention are always low. In fact, here, I'll go back. It was $5,000. Like, it's always low because it's really hard to serve 30% and below on the median income. There's always something with federal dollars. There's always something. Okay, any questions about any of this? Okay, just a quick screenshot of an example. You'll see that this scoring sheet is much less intensive than the one I just talked about for continuum of care. I think it's only one page, right, Nancy? I think it's just one.
Yeah, I think it is only one page.
I think it's just one page. But again, talks about cost effectiveness. How, does this applicant have the capacity to do this project? These are less data driven and they are more application review driven by the PFET members. Okay. Emergency food and shelter. That's Sean and Daisha. Well, it's probably Sean. Daisha's probably here to learn.
Daisha's been getting caught up to speed with EFSP. It's her favorite thing to do, she says.
Said no one ever.
I don't mind EFSP. I like that kind of thing. So EFSP covers food, rent, mortgage, utilities, things involved with feeding and sheltering individuals. I have listed here some of our previous allocations through EFSP. It typically falls around $200,000 in a regular phase, but much like the others with an influx of funding, we've been receiving extra dollars. So there was a COVID fund and there was an ARPA fund or phase. So you can see the ARPA phase was very large. So we had to distribute that. We had adopted priorities for spending these dollars. They typically are no less than 50% of emergency mass congregate shelter, individual shelter nights, rental assistance and utility assistance. Because there was so much money to spend, we made a couple addendums to those priorities. One being no less than 25% going to shelters. They just really didn't have the ability to spend down any more than we were giving them. And then we added food. Just as a way to be flexible with the funding and to spend it down. The process for this one is a little more minimal than the ones that Kelly and Nancy have reviewed. We do advertise the funding, organizations apply. They submit an application to me. there is no formal way of scoring. I just distribute the applications to PFET, and then our committee reviews the applications, and then we schedule a meeting to review and rank the applications, and then allocate dollars as they fit. So then PFET makes a recommendation to the coalition, and then there is a formal coalition vote on those allocations. Typically, the phases would run annually, but it seemed like around phase 34 and 35, things started stacking on top of each other, and they haven't gotten caught up since. And then sometimes, well, like phase 39 and ARPA are being run congruently, so there really isn't a method to that, it seems.
Sean, you bring up a good point about timelines and grants and when all of these things need to be reviewed. EFSP, ESG, COC, they don't really have a set timeline. If we could provide you guys with, you know, you're going to review this in this month, you're going to review this in this month, we would. But unfortunately, they just don't operate that way. A lot of times we don't know when the federal government will release funds and request that we apply for them. They typically don't give us a lot of leeway in how long we have to do these things. So it can be a little challenging in that regard. I think continuum of care typically will happen sometime over the summer. I know, why do they do that? No one knows. But it typically will come out sometime between, I know this sounds ridiculous, but sometime between April and September. I don't anticipate it this year until summer. I'm not sure when in the summer. So I know that's a problem because people have vacations and it always causes issues. Emergency Solutions Grant is a little bit better. I think it typically, when you do it every 3 years, it will typically be on a schedule of, it usually happens in the fall, I think. And then is awarded typically in January. People will receive their funding. Sean just mentioned EFSP has kind of been all over the board. And I think the other thing that's hard about EFSP, and Sean will say this far more eloquently than I will, is a lot of times the money is distributed, but it's the time frame that you have to have spent the money has already passed. So we're saying there's $100,000, but you have to spend it on things you did 6 months ago. That makes it really hard for programs that aren't used to that strategy to kind of step into that funding stream. So we do typically see the same applicants year in and year out because they're the only ones who know how that kind of thing works.
Right, that's correct. And actually EFSP made a recent update. They've in the past only offered rental assistance and utility assistance for 1 month for individuals of assistance. They've recently increased it to 3 months. And I think that was in an effort to try to spend down some of the funding because there was a lot of it and a lot of communities were not able to spend it all in the past couple of phases. So I think that's all. Next slide.
Oh, these are just who you funded.
Yeah, and then I have listed here who's typically funded Bell socialization services for the shelter and then individual shelter nights. Supplies and equipment was something they just added again in an effort to spend down some of those extra funds. YWCA York, typically just the shelter, but they did add ISN in an effort to spend down extra money. Salvation Army has been typically our hub for utility assistance. We did bring in Community Progress Council. They were one of our newer funded agencies for utility assistance. That was prior to ERAP that we made that decision, and then they determined they weren't able to spend the utility assistance and ended up giving it back, and they did not come back into the fold for this current funding round. New Hope Ministries is another newer agency that we brought in for utility assistance. They've been spending a lot of food for their food bank, and then individual shelter nights and rental assistance. And then YMCA of York County was typically for their men's shelter, but they recently got into utility assistance and food support at Southern Community Services down in Shrewsbury. Any questions? Okay. I think that's all for me.
I have to exit out for a meeting, but thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you guys soon.
Thanks, Iris.
Thanks, Iris.
Have a good day.
Welcome aboard.
Yeah.
Our last one, I think, is Home for Good. Are you doing this one or am I doing this one, Nancy?
I gave that to you because it seems like it's different every year. So it's hard to explain.
It is different every year. So Home for Good is a pretty neat opportunity that is funded through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh and the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, which is PHFA. Basically, the bank takes a portion of their interest payments through their banking and dedicates it to the Home for Good process. Home for Good is a very flexible source of assistance to work on housing and homelessness, which we all say all the time is what we need, because there are so many tight parameters around the other funding streams we just talked about. There are kind of, as a result of those tight parameters, a lot of gaps. There's a lot of people we can't serve. There's a lot of things, even with households we're serving, that we can't pay for, but the household still needs. So this is kind of an opportunity to plug in some of those gaps. The unfortunate side is that it's not very much money. Throughout the years that we've had Home for Good, and I think we've had Home for Good for about 5 years. I think 22 is the 5th year. It has ranged from $50,000 to $75,000. We saw a higher amount, 75 early on. The last 2 years we've seen between 55 and 60. So we're not seeing a large amount of money. It's very hard to start a new program, for example, with these kinds of funds. These funds work a lot better as a partner to an existing program or funds from another source being used to fill gaps. This process is a little bit unique, but I kind of love it because it requires the coalition to receive the applications and to review them, and then to decide what the priority is in your community that you feel should be funded. We also have the opportunity, though, we are always required to show all of the applicants in the order that we prioritized them. So if there is additional funding one year and we say we really want program number 1, but program number 2 was also a really vital need, they will go ahead and automatically fund that second program. So it's nice to be able to show all the interest that you got in a program, not just the ones that you're approving funding on. And so it's kind of nice to show, like, we have all these needs, but we know we can only fund this many. Home for Good will allow us to do prevention work. So it will allow for unique strategies around prevention. I don't typically recommend it as eviction prevention, where you pay back rent, because there just is not enough money there. Those of you that are familiar with ERAP know that we spent $30 million in like 9 months. So when you're talking about $50,000 to $70,000, it's just not the best use of those funds. But if you're funding something that allows you to do more education or to do mediation with a landlord to keep someone in a program, those would be great opportunities under this funding stream. You can also use this to divert. There is a process in housing called diversion. And diversion looks at the whole situation, but looks to see if there is something that you could pay for out of a flexible source that would keep someone out of shelter or would keep them in their housing, any of those types of situations. So, examples can be as simple as, will your aunt let me pay $100 a month to have you stay with her? Or will a flexible fund pay to put a ramp on your house because you can no longer do the stairs to get in and out of your home? It's diversion to keep people from being homeless. They also love innovative solutions. I laugh at this because I feel like you see this language under like private philanthropy all the time. No offense to Nancy, who works in private philanthropy, but everybody always wants some new and exciting innovation, and they are no different. They're looking for creative strategies around housing and homelessness, very interested in doing those types of things. We also can do critical needs. So if the coalition identifies a critical need and someone applies for a funding opportunity under a critical need, we can say we are prioritizing this project because it meets a critical need. So much broader than the very narrow parameters around specific types of housing, specific types of programming that we see under the other funding streams. The nice thing about Home for Good coming through the coalition is that we know who's applying. There is another kind of loose and flexible funding stream through the state called PHARE, P-H-A-R-E, that also provides a lot of flexible housing dollars, but no one at the county level ever reviews any of that. So we never know who even applied for it until the awards come out. And when you're talking about filling gaps as a collaborative effort, like a coalition, it's really helpful to know who's applying. You only ever know who's funded. So we're kind of working on recommendations to the state on having more engagement at the county level, just so that we're aware of what's going on. But those flexible sources are huge because federal dollars aren't flexible. In 2021, we only had one application for Home for Good, which was unusual. In the past years, we had multiple applications. We had more projects than we could fund. But people were very overwhelmed in 20 and 21, and we did not get the same level of applications. But the application we did get in 21 was 4th Street Outreach, which was a brand new project. It was an innovative solution for us in York County. And it also met a critical need, making sure that we were encountering and working with those who were on the streets, which we were seeing as an ever increasing population. They're still increasing. So we funded them with the max amount that we received, which was $55,000. The funding itself is dedicated by the Federal Home Loan Bank in 3-year increments, but the application process is yearly. So we know there's funding for Home for Good for 3 years, but every year we still go through an RFP, we still go through an application process, and PFET still reviews it every year. Any questions about that one? Okay. There is a scoring sheet for Home for Good. We use the template of kind of what we used for COC, for Continuum of Care, but it is not as intensive. And it is much more qualitative. So we are absolutely looking at qualitative opportunities to score projects well, or to say, I'm just not sure they've thought through this. We do often, as a PFET, try to provide feedback to applicants so that they know things that they might want to review and strengthen if they are interested in coming back. If they're not funded on this round, we recommend things that they might want to strengthen or review. So there's a lot of opportunity for that with Home for Good through their tool. And that's it.
No, that was a lot.
I know, it always is. It always is. And we did record it, so we'll send it out to everybody so that they have it. But
I would say don't panic. I mean, I think Tina and Robin, as having been new, I mean, I hope they can attest to that it's not as complex as it seems. It's not as overwhelming as it seems initially.
And you're not
It
alone,
really is not.
right? Like, you have this whole group. You're not alone. So if you're trying to score something and it doesn't make sense, it's completely acceptable to come back to
Right.
this group while we're meeting and say, I just don't understand. And we walk through it.
Yep.
Also, the more time to do it, the easier it gets, and you learn something new about it each time. So
Yeah. And we're a small community, realistically speaking. We're a small community. We're a single county that we're looking at all of these funding sources for. We have a finite number of providers that apply for this funding. And so what you find is it really helps you knit together a framework of who's receiving funding, what they're funding, where the gaps are, as you go through this process. So it's pretty neat to see how it all works together.
And I would say we've been successful at getting more money coming into York County over the past 5 or 6 years. So that's, I mean, that's a testament to our providers, but also to this group for being agile and recognizing where we can fill gaps and take advantage of opportunities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
You'll
Wow.
probably have questions. That's okay. If anything comes to you, you can reach out to Nancy or to me. It doesn't matter. And we'll make sure you get an answer. I will let this finish processing on Zoom, and then I'll send out the link to this recording and also the PowerPoint we used today.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
See everyone.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.